On Christmas night, 1996, while most families across America were wrapped in warmth and silence, one grand home in Boulder, Colorado became the stage for a chilling mystery. Inside, a 6-year-old girl vanished. Hours later, she was discovered in the basement. But what truly unsettled investigators was not only her fate, it was the note left behind in the kitchen. 3 handwritten pages demanding $118,000, the exact amount of her father's holiday bonus. The words were dramatic, almost theatrical, and the paper and pen had come from inside the house itself. Whoever wrote it had lingered there, calmly crafting a message that felt more like a performance than a threat. Imagine the scene. The quiet hum of a refrigerator, the faint glow of Christmas lights still twinkling outside, and on the counter, a letter that seemed to defy logic. Was it the work of a stranger who slipped silently into the mansion? Or was the truth hidden within the family itself? The investigation stumbled almost immediately. Evidence was mishandled, the home was never properly sealed, and friends and neighbors walked freely through rooms that should have been preserved. Each mistake blurred the line between fact and speculation. One lesser-known detail that continues to haunt investigators is how the ransom note instructed the family not to call the police. Yet the first thing Patsy Ramsey did was dial 911. That contradiction has fueled decades of debate, adding another layer of confusion to an already tangled case. The story of JonBenét Ramsey is not just about a child lost too soon. It is about unanswered questions, about a note that reads more like a riddle than a demand, and about an investigation that left behind more shadows than clarity. And even now, nearly 30 years later, the mystery refuses to fade. The case remains open, the questions remain burning, and the world still wonders. Was the truth hidden in plain sight all along? If stories like this keep you searching for answers, stay with us. We continue to explore the investigations that never rest, the mysteries that demand to be told. Before she became the center of one of America's most haunting mysteries, JonBenét Ramsey was known for something else entirely: beauty pageants. Picture this: a 6-year-old girl standing under bright stage lights in Colorado, wearing elaborate gowns that sparkled like diamonds, her blonde hair perfectly curled, her makeup applied with professional precision. She moved across those stages with the poise of someone 3 times her age, her smile radiating confidence that seemed almost impossible for a child so young. She wasn't just participating, she was winning. JonBenét collected crowns the way other children collected toys. Little Miss Colorado, America's Royale Miss, National Tiny Miss Beauty. Each performance was rehearsed, polished, perfected. Every wave, every turn, every choreographed moment designed to captivate judges and audiences alike. Her father, John Ramsey, had built a billion-dollar computer business from the ground up. Her mother, Patsy Ramsey, had once worn her own crown as Miss West Virginia. They lived in a massive Tudor-style home in Boulder, with 15 rooms sprawling across 7,000 square feet. From the outside, they embodied the American dream in its most glamorous form. But those pageant images, those videos of JonBenét performing in evening gowns and swimsuits, singing and dancing with adult mannerisms, made some people deeply uncomfortable. Critics whispered that childhood was being stolen from her, that she was being pushed into a world she couldn't possibly understand. What many people don't realize is that Patsy had enrolled JonBenét in pageants partly as a way to bond with her daughter, reliving her own glory days. But the little girl seemed to genuinely love it. Friends of the family would later describe how JonBenét lit up when preparing for competitions, how she'd practice her routines with pure joy. Then came Christmas night, 1996. The Ramseys returned home after celebrating at a friend's house. JonBenét, tired from the festivities, was carried inside. The house fell quiet, lights dimmed, a typical holiday evening coming to its peaceful end, or so it seemed. Because in just a few hours, that luxurious home would transform into something no one could have imagined. When the sun rose the next morning, the perfect facade would shatter completely. And the first thing police discovered would be so bizarre, so theatrical, that it seemed ripped straight from a psychological thriller. A ransom note. But not just any ransom note. December 26, 1996. 5:52 in the morning. Patsy Ramsey's bare feet touched the cold wooden steps as she descended the spiral staircase of her Boulder home. The house was still wrapped in the quiet darkness of early morning. Christmas lights from the night before cast soft shadows across the walls. Then she saw it. 3 pages, handwritten, laid out carefully on the bottom steps leading to the kitchen, positioned exactly where she couldn't miss them. Her hands trembled as she picked up the first page. The words sent ice through her veins. "Mr. Ramsey, listen carefully. We are a group of individuals that represent a small foreign faction. We have your daughter. A ransom note." The demand was specific, oddly specific. Exactly $118,000. Not $100,000, not $150,000, $118,000. What most people don't know is that this number wasn't random at all. It was nearly identical to the bonus John Ramsey had received from his company just months earlier. Whoever wrote this knew intimate details about the family's finances. But as Patsy's eyes raced down the pages, something felt deeply wrong. The note rambled. It threatened. It referenced action movies. It used phrases like attaché for a briefcase and SBTC as a mysterious signature. It warned the family multiple times not to contact police, not to tell anyone, or their daughter would be beheaded. 3 full pages. No professional criminal writes 3 pages. Kidnappers want to get in and get out. They don't sit down and compose letters that read like movie scripts. Patsy screamed for John. Within minutes, despite the note's explicit warnings, she dialed 911. Her voice cracked with panic on the recorded call. "We have a kidnapping," she gasped. "Hurry, please." Police arrived at 6:05. Officers began searching the enormous house room by room, looking for signs of forced entry, for any clue about where JonBenét might have been taken. But then forensic investigators made a discovery that turned the entire case inside out. The notepad the ransom letter was written on came from inside the house, from Patsy's own desk. The pen, too, and there was more. Several practice versions of the note had been started on earlier pages of the same notepad, then abandoned. Whoever wrote this had taken their time. They'd drafted it, revised it, perfected it, all while inside the Ramsey home. This wasn't a quick grab-and-go operation. Someone had spent at least 20 minutes, possibly longer, sitting calmly in that house, composing a theatrical ransom demand while a 6-year-old girl was somewhere in the building. The realization hit investigators like a punch to the chest, but they held on to hope. The note said JonBenét had been taken. Maybe she was still alive. Maybe there was still time. Hours dragged by. Friends of the family arrived to offer support. The house filled with people, contaminating what would later be recognized as a crime scene. Detective Linda Arndt, one of the lead investigators, felt a growing sense of unease. Something wasn't adding up. Then, just after 1 in the afternoon, she made a decision. She asked John Ramsey and his friend Fleet White to search the house one more time, to look anywhere they hadn't looked before. John headed straight for the basement. He walked through the dim corridor, opened a door to a small wine cellar room that had been checked earlier but found locked. This time it opened. The room was dark. He reached for the light, and there, on the cold concrete floor, covered with a white blanket, was JonBenét. John's scream echoed through the entire house. He grabbed his daughter's body and carried her upstairs, destroying evidence in his desperation and shock. Patsy collapsed at the sight. The ransom note had been a lie. JonBenét had never left the house. She had been there the entire time, just feet below where police had been standing all morning. And what investigators discovered about the condition of that basement room would raise questions that remain unanswered to this day. The wine cellar in the Ramsey basement was barely bigger than a closet. No windows. A single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. The kind of space that feels forgotten, tucked away in the farthest corner of the house where sunlight never reaches. This is where JonBenét spent her final moments. When John Ramsey carried his daughter's body up those basement stairs, cradling her against his chest, Detective Linda Arndt felt her heart stop. She did a mental count of everyone in the house. 7 adults, 7 potential witnesses, and only 1 of her. In that instant, she later recalled, she put her hand on her weapon and prepared for the worst. What forensic experts discovered painted a disturbing picture. JonBenét had sustained 2 catastrophic injuries, a devastating blow to her skull that fractured her head so severely it created an 8.5-inch crack, and a ligature made from white cord and a broken paintbrush handle, twisted around her neck in a configuration that investigators would later describe as a garrote. But here's what haunted the medical examiners. They couldn't determine which came first. The head injury would have rendered her unconscious almost instantly, causing massive brain swelling. Yet the strangulation showed signs of a struggle, of consciousness. The 2 injuries seemed to exist in impossible contradiction with each other. Some experts believed the head trauma came first, followed by the ligature up to 90 minutes later. Others argued the opposite. What most people never learned is that there was food found in JonBenét's digestive system, fresh pineapple. But the family insisted she had fallen asleep in the car on the way home from the Christmas party and had been carried straight to bed. She hadn't eaten anything after they arrived home, they said. So who gave her pineapple? And when? Meanwhile, upstairs, the crime scene was disintegrating by the minute. No one had secured the house. This wasn't protocol. This was chaos. Friends continued arriving to comfort the Ramseys. They moved through rooms. They sat on furniture. They touched doorknobs and countertops. The victim advocate assigned to the family even cleaned the kitchen, washing dishes and wiping down surfaces that might have contained crucial evidence. John Ramsey had already compromised the basement when he carried JonBenét upstairs, his clothing fibers now mixed with whatever the perpetrator might have left behind. Patsy had thrown herself over her daughter's body, weeping uncontrollably, adding another layer of contamination. By the time the Boulder Police Department realized what they were dealing with, the house looked nothing like it had at 5:52 that morning. Detective Arndt would later testify that she felt completely overwhelmed, left alone to manage what had become one of the most high-profile cases in American history, with no backup and no clear direction. But the evidence that remained told a strange story. Investigators searched for signs of forced entry. They examined every window, every door, every possible point where an intruder might have broken in. Most were locked from the inside. There was a basement window with a broken pane, but spider webs stretched across the opening, undisturbed, snow-covered parts of the yard, yet there were no footprints leading to or from the house except those belonging to the family. One window well showed what appeared to be a scuff mark and a small opening, but experts debated whether a grown person could have squeezed through the narrow space. The house alarm system hadn't been activated that night. The Ramseys later explained they rarely used it, despite living in a 7,000-square-foot home filled with valuable possessions. As forensic teams combed through the basement, they found something else peculiar. A suitcase positioned beneath the broken window, as if someone had used it as a step. Inside the suitcase, a pillow and a blanket. But no one could explain why those items would be packed together or left in that specific location. And then there was the flashlight, sitting on the kitchen counter, wiped completely clean of fingerprints. Not a single print on the handle, the lens, or the battery compartment. The Ramseys claimed they didn't know where it came from, that it wasn't theirs. But investigators theorized it might have been the weapon that caused the skull fracture. Heavy enough, the right shape, found in plain sight, as if someone had carefully erased their presence from it. Every piece of evidence seemed to raise 2 new questions. If an intruder broke in, why was there no clear point of entry? If someone from inside the house was involved, why would they construct such an elaborate ransom note? If this was planned, why was it so chaotic? If it was spontaneous, why were there practice drafts of the letter? The Boulder Police Department found themselves facing something they had never encountered before. Their small city, known for its university and peaceful mountain views, averaged fewer than 2 suspicious deaths per year. Most of their officers had never worked a case like this. And as pressure mounted from the media, from the public, from the department itself, the investigation began to splinter. Some detectives became convinced the answer lay within the family. Others insisted an outsider must have been responsible. The evidence seemed to point in every direction and no direction at all. But while investigators argued over theories, one undeniable fact remained at the center of everything. A 6-year-old girl was gone, and someone in or around that house on that Christmas night knew exactly what happened. The question was whether the truth would ever come to light. Within 48 hours, the Ramsey family went from grieving parents to prime suspects in the court of public opinion. It started with small things, observations that felt off. Patsy Ramsey appeared on camera at JonBenét's funeral wearing the same outfit she'd had on Christmas night, the same black velvet pants and red turtleneck. Detectives noted it immediately. Why hadn't she changed? Some saw it as a sign of deep trauma, a mother so shattered she couldn't function. Others saw it as evidence of something darker, a woman who never went to bed that night because she was awake doing something else. John Ramsey seemed eerily composed during interviews, his businessman demeanor intact even as he discussed his daughter's death. He answered questions with precision, rarely showing emotion. To some, this looked like shock. To others, it looked like control. Then there were the decisions that baffled investigators. 4 days after JonBenét's body was found, the Ramseys hired a team of high-powered criminal defense attorneys. Not a single lawyer, a team. They stopped cooperating with police for formal interviews. When they finally did sit down with investigators months later, it was only under carefully negotiated conditions, with their attorneys present and with limitations on what could be asked. The Boulder Police Department interpreted this as consciousness of guilt. The Ramseys insisted they were simply protecting themselves from a department that had already decided they were responsible. But it was the ransom note that kept pulling investigators back to Patsy. 4 handwriting experts examined samples of her writing alongside the 3-page letter. The results were maddeningly inconclusive. Some said she couldn't be eliminated as the author. Others said the writing didn't match. One expert noted that certain letter formations, particularly the lowercase a, and the way words trailed off at the end of sentences, bore striking similarities to Patsy's natural hand. What the public never learned is that investigators asked Patsy to provide handwriting samples multiple times over several months, and her writing appeared to change slightly with each sample, becoming less similar to the ransom note as time went on. Was this natural variation or deliberate alteration? The Boulder police became increasingly convinced the answer was inside that house, and then their focus shifted to someone unexpected, Burke Ramsey, JonBenét's 9-year-old brother. He had been home that night, asleep upstairs, according to his parents. He claimed he never woke up, never heard anything unusual, but investigators found this hard to believe. His sister had been attacked just 1 floor below his bedroom. Police had arrived with sirens. The house had erupted into chaos, and a 9-year-old boy slept through all of it? A theory began to take shape among certain detectives. What if this wasn't a planned incident at all? What if it was a tragic accident between siblings that spiraled out of control? The pineapple found in JonBenét's digestive system appeared in crime scene photos sitting in a bowl on the kitchen table with a large serving spoon. Burke's fingerprints were on that bowl. So were Patsy's, but both denied knowing anything about it. Some investigators theorized that Burke and JonBenét had come downstairs after everyone was in bed, that they'd snacked on pineapple together, that something happened, an argument, a game gone wrong, a moment of childhood conflict that ended in unspeakable tragedy, and that the parents, discovering what occurred, had staged everything else to protect their only surviving child. But there were massive problems with this theory. Burke was 9 years old. The garrote around JonBenét's neck was sophisticated, constructed with knowledge of knots and mechanics. The head injury required significant force. And even if a child could have caused one of these injuries, could a 9-year-old have inflicted both? Most experts said no. The violence was too extreme, too calculated. Yet the theory persisted, whispered in newsrooms, and debated on talk shows across America. Burke himself was interviewed by child psychologists and investigators. The recordings show a boy who seemed oddly detached, smiling at inappropriate moments, giving strange answers to straightforward questions. But childhood trauma experts explained this could simply be how a 9-year-old processes overwhelming grief and confusion. He was never charged, never officially named a suspect, but the cloud of suspicion followed him for decades. Meanwhile, the media circus reached a fever pitch. Camera crews camped outside the Ramsey home 24 hours a day. Helicopters circled overhead. Tabloids published wild theories weekly. JonBenét's pageant photos appeared on every magazine cover, every news broadcast, every front page. The image of her in full makeup, wearing a tiny evening gown, became seared into the national consciousness. People who had never heard of child beauty pageants suddenly had strong opinions about them. The Ramseys were accused of exploiting their daughter, of turning her into a sexual object, of creating an environment that attracted dangerous attention. Patsy defended the pageants fiercely, insisting JonBenét loved performing, that it was bonding time for mother and daughter, that people were twisting something innocent into something sinister. But the damage was done. In the public imagination, those pageant images became evidence of poor parenting at best. Something far worse at worst. The case consumed America for months. Everyone had a theory. Everyone knew who was responsible, except no one actually knew anything for certain. And then, just when it seemed like the investigation might finally be narrowing toward a conclusion, forensic scientists discovered something in the evidence that nobody had anticipated. DNA, male DNA, found on JonBenét's underwear and mixed with her blood. DNA that didn't match anyone in the Ramsey family. DNA that didn't match anyone in their circle of friends or acquaintances. DNA that didn't match anyone in the national database. An unknown male had left genetic material on a 6-year-old girl's clothing, and investigators had no idea who he was. The discovery should have shifted the entire investigation, should have pointed authorities away from the family and toward an intruder theory, should have changed everything. But by then, the damage to the Ramseys' reputation was complete. The narrative was set, and in the minds of many, no piece of evidence would ever be enough to erase the suspicion that had taken root. The case that had started with a ransom note and ended with a little girl in a basement had become something else entirely. A referendum on parenting, on wealth, on media obsession, on the American justice system itself. And somewhere in all that noise, the truth about what really happened on Christmas night, 1996, remained buried. 1997 turned into 1998, then 1999. The investigation dragged on, consuming resources, destroying reputations, but producing no arrests. Then, in 2003, everything shifted. New DNA technology had emerged, more sophisticated than what existed in 1996. Forensic scientists decided to retest evidence from the crime scene using these advanced methods. What they found stopped everyone cold. Male DNA. Touch DNA, they called it. Genetic material so minute it could have been transferred by a simple brush of skin against fabric. It was discovered in 2 separate locations, mixed with JonBenét's blood on her underwear and on the waistband of her long johns. The same unknown male profile in both places. This wasn't contamination from the chaotic crime scene. This wasn't a lab error. This was biological evidence that someone outside the Ramsey family had been in direct contact with JonBenét that night. The implications were staggering. In 2008, 12 years after JonBenét's death, the Boulder District Attorney Mary Lacey did something unprecedented. She sent the Ramsey family a formal letter of apology. The DNA evidence she wrote had cleared them. All of them. John, Patsy, and Burke. The family that had been tried and convicted in the court of public opinion was officially exonerated. But by then, Patsy Ramsey was gone. She had died of ovarian cancer in 2006, never living to see her name cleared. She spent the last decade of her life under a cloud of suspicion. Her daughter's death followed immediately by accusations that she was responsible for it. Now, investigators faced a more terrifying possibility. An intruder. A stranger who had invaded that home on Christmas night. But who? The Boulder police reopened old files with fresh eyes. They compiled lists, hundreds of names, people who had been in the Ramsey orbit that winter. A former housekeeper who knew the layout of the house intimately. A handyman who had keys to multiple doors. A Santa Claus impersonator who had visited JonBenét at a Christmas party just days before her death and had told her he was going to make a special visit to her after Christmas. That last detail sent chills through investigators when they discovered it. Bill McReynolds, a retired journalism professor who played Santa Claus for Boulder families, became a person of interest. His wife had even written a play years earlier about a child being taken to a basement, a detail so eerily specific it seemed impossible to be coincidence. But McReynolds was ruled out. His DNA didn't match, his alibi held, and he passed away in 2002. His name never fully cleared in the public eye, but never charged with any crime. Then there was John Mark Carr, a former school teacher who confessed to the incident in 2006. He provided detailed descriptions of what happened, spoke about JonBenét with disturbing obsession, and claimed he had been with her when she died. The media exploded. Finally, an answer. Finally, closure. Except his DNA didn't match either. His confession was filled with facts that contradicted the evidence, and investigators discovered he wasn't even in Colorado on Christmas of 1996. He had been in Georgia with his family, a fact confirmed by multiple witnesses. His confession was false, the product of a disturbed mind obsessed with the case. The investigation collapsed again. What most people don't realize is that over the years, more than 140 people have confessed to being involved in JonBenét's death. 140 separate individuals, each claiming responsibility, each proven to be lying or mistaken. The case had become something beyond a criminal investigation. It had become a cultural obsession, a black hole that pulled in conspiracy theorists, attention seekers, and genuinely disturbed individuals who inserted themselves into the narrative. Meanwhile, the DNA profile sat in databases, waiting for a match that never came. Modern investigators used genetic genealogy, the same technique that caught the Golden State offender decades after his crime. They uploaded the unknown DNA to ancestry websites, hoping to find distant relatives who might lead them to the source. Nothing. Either the person had no relatives in those databases, or the DNA sample was too degraded to produce usable genealogical matches. Every lead evaporated. Every theory hit a wall. Because here's the maddening reality of the JonBenét Ramsey case. The evidence supports multiple contradictory narratives simultaneously. If you believe an intruder was responsible, you can point to the DNA, to the basement window, to the possibility that someone hid in that massive house for hours, waiting for the family to sleep. If you believe someone in the family was involved, you can point to the ransom note written on Patsy's notepad, to the lack of clear forced entry, to the bizarre staging of the scene, to the pineapple that no one will explain. If you think it was an accident covered up, you can construct a timeline that almost makes sense, until you remember the garrote, the head injury, the calculated brutality that doesn't fit a panicked parent trying to protect a child. Every answer creates new questions. Every question has multiple possible answers. Veteran detectives who worked the case for years remain divided. Some are absolutely certain the family was involved. Others are equally certain an outsider committed this crime. Both sides are convinced they're right. Both sides have evidence to support their position. And that's perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this entire tragedy. We live in an age where we expect answers, where forensic science and DNA technology solve cold cases regularly, where genetic genealogy brings justice to victims decades after their deaths. But JonBenét Ramsey's case resists every attempt at resolution. 28 years later, that unknown male DNA profile remains unmatched. The person who left that genetic material has never been identified. They could be anywhere. They could be anyone. Or, as some investigators quietly suggest, the DNA could be irrelevant. A red herring. Trace evidence from a factory worker who packaged the underwear, from a store employee who handled the clothing, from any of dozens of innocent sources that have nothing to do with what happened that night. If you followed this case, if you formed your own theory about what really happened, share your thoughts. Tell others about this story, because somewhere out there, someone knows something. Someone saw something. Someone holds a piece of information that could finally bring clarity to one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries. The truth is still out there, buried under decades of speculation, media frenzy, and contradictory evidence. But what happened next made the story even darker, because the tragedy of JonBenét Ramsey didn't end with her death. It rippled outward, destroying lives, ending careers, and revealing something deeply troubling about how we consume tragedy as entertainment. July 9, 2008. District Attorney Mary Lacey stood before cameras in Boulder, Colorado, holding a single sheet of paper. Her hands were steady, but her voice carried the weight of 12 years of controversy, accusation, and pain. The Boulder District Attorney's Office does not consider any member of the Ramsey family, including John, Patsy, or Burke Ramsey, as suspects in this case. Official exoneration. After more than a decade. But instead of bringing closure, the announcement tore the case wide open all over again. Half the country erupted in vindication. Finally, they said. Finally, someone acknowledged what should have been obvious from the beginning. The DNA proves it. An intruder was responsible. The Ramseys were victims, not perpetrators. The other half rejected it completely. The DNA means nothing, they argued. It's touch DNA, microscopic, possibly irrelevant. The evidence inside that house still points to the family. The ransom note, the lack of forced entry, the strange behavior. You can't just erase all of that with a press conference. True crime forums exploded. Television specials multiplied. The case that had dominated headlines in the late 90s came roaring back with renewed intensity. What most people don't know is that the exoneration itself was controversial within law enforcement. Many Boulder detectives who had worked the case for years felt blindsided. They hadn't been consulted. They still believed the answer was inside the Ramsey home. And now the DA had publicly declared the family innocent without, in their view, sufficient justification. The rift between the district attorney's office and the Boulder Police Department, which had been growing for years, became irreparable. But for John Ramsey, the exoneration was bittersweet. His wife, Patsy, had died 2 years earlier, in 2006, still carrying the burden of suspicion. She never got to hear those words, never got to see her name officially cleared. She spent her final years battling cancer while simultaneously battling accusations that she had harmed her own daughter. Burke, now an adult, tried to rebuild a life under the constant shadow of public scrutiny. He rarely spoke about the case, avoided media, attempted to disappear into normalcy. Then, in 2016, he broke his silence. A CBS documentary titled The Case of JonBenét Ramsey aired, featuring a team of investigators who reviewed the evidence and concluded that Burke likely struck his sister with a flashlight during an argument, and that the parents staged everything else to protect him. The show didn't present this as theory. It presented it as conclusion, as fact. Burke sued CBS and the production company for $750 million, claiming defamation. The case settled out of court in 2019 for an undisclosed amount, but the damage was done. His name was back in headlines. The accusations were resurrected. The nightmare continued. Meanwhile, the Boulder Police Department continued working the case, quietly, methodically. In 2010, they assembled a new team, fresh eyes, detectives who hadn't been involved in the original investigation and weren't anchored to any particular theory. They digitized thousands of pages of documents, re-interviewed witnesses, used modern forensic techniques on old evidence. They discovered things that had been overlooked, small details that took on new significance decades later. A stun gun, or something resembling one, might have been used on JonBenét based on marks found on her body. But no stun gun was ever recovered from the house or the surrounding area. If true, this suggested premeditation, planning, not a spontaneous act. Fibers from Patsy's jacket were found on the duct tape that had been placed over JonBenét's mouth. But Patsy had held her daughter's body after it was discovered, so the fibers could have transferred then, or they could have been there before. The evidence proved nothing conclusively. A baseball bat was found outside the house with fibers on it that might have matched the carpet in the basement. Could this have been the weapon that fractured JonBenét's skull? Possibly. But the bat belonged to Burke. It could have been outside for any number of innocent reasons. Every piece of evidence had two explanations. Every explanation had contradictory evidence. In 2013, investigators tried a new approach. They brought in a grand jury, 21 citizens who would review all the evidence, hear from all the experts, and decide if anyone should be charged. The grand jury met for over a year. They examined more than 30,000 pages of documents. They heard from dozens of witnesses, and in October of 1999, they reached a decision. This detail remained secret for 14 years, until 2013, when reporters finally obtained the grand jury's original indictment through legal pressure. The documents revealed something shocking. The grand jury had voted to indict both John and Patsy Ramsey, not for directly causing JonBenét's death, but for child abuse resulting in death and accessory to a crime. The language suggested they believed the parents knew who was responsible and helped cover it up. But District Attorney Alex Hunter refused to sign the indictment. He didn't believe the evidence was strong enough to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. Without his signature, no charges could be filed. So the grand jury's decision sat in a sealed file for over a decade, unknown to the public, while the Ramseys maintained they had been cleared. When this information finally became public in 2013, it reignited the entire controversy. People who believed in the Ramseys' guilt felt vindicated. People who believed in their innocence felt betrayed. And the case continued to evolve, to shift, to resist any simple conclusion. Today, the investigation remains technically open. The Boulder Police Department maintains a dedicated tip line. They follow up on credible leads. They periodically review the evidence using new technologies. But here's the haunting reality. The person or persons responsible may never be identified. The original crime scene was contaminated beyond repair within hours. Crucial evidence was likely destroyed before investigators even knew what they were looking for. Witnesses have died. Memories have faded. Time has eroded certainty. If an intruder was responsible, they left almost no trace. They moved through that house like a ghost, entering and exiting without clear evidence, leaving behind only microscopic DNA that leads nowhere. If someone in the family was responsible, they've maintained their story for nearly 3 decades with unwavering consistency, despite intense scrutiny, despite polygraphs, despite grand jury proceedings. The case has become something bigger than a single tragedy. It's a mirror reflecting our obsession with true crime, our distrust of wealth and perfection, our hunger for definitive answers in an uncertain world. Dozens of books have been written, hundreds of television specials produced, thousands of articles published, millions of words dedicated to analyzing, theorizing, and debating what happened in that Boulder mansion on Christmas night, 1996. But JonBenét herself has almost disappeared beneath the weight of all that speculation. The real little girl who loved performing, who giggled with her brother, who was learning to read and write, who had her whole life ahead of her. She became an icon, a symbol, a mystery, but she was a child, 6 years old, and someone took that away from her. Whether that person will ever be held accountable remains one of the great unanswered questions of modern criminal investigation. The case that captivated America for decades shows no signs of fading. New generations discover it. New theories emerge. New technologies offer new possibilities. The Boulder Police Department says they will never close the case. They will continue investigating until it's solved. Whether that happens in 1 year or 50 years or never, they've committed to pursuing justice for JonBenét Ramsey. Because somewhere, buried in those thousands of pages of evidence, in those crime scene photos, in those witness statements, in that strange ransom note, in that unknown DNA profile, the truth exists. It's there, waiting, hidden in plain sight or lost forever. And that uncertainty, that maddening possibility that we might never know, is perhaps the most haunting aspect of the entire story. 28 years. That's how long the world has been asking the same question. What happened to JonBenét Ramsey? And 28 years later, we still don't have an answer. This story was never just about a crime. It was about childhood stolen, about innocence shattered on the coldest night of the year, about a little girl who should have grown up to be 28 years old now, living a life we'll never get to see. JonBenét would have graduated high school, gone to college, maybe fallen in love, maybe had children of her own, maybe continued performing, or maybe discovered she wanted something completely different from those pageant stages. We'll never know any of it. What we do know is that her case exposed every crack in our justice system. The contaminated crime scene, the turf wars between police and prosecutors, the media circus that turned tragedy into entertainment, the way we devour true crime stories while forgetting there are real people, real families, real grief at the center of them all. John Ramsey is 78 years old now. He spent more than half his life seeking answers, defending his family's name, and living with a loss that never heals. He still gives interviews, still pushes for new DNA testing, still believes that modern technology, genealogical databases, and fresh investigative approaches could finally identify who was responsible. Burke Ramsey, now in his 30s, has tried to build a private life away from the spotlight that consumed his childhood. But the case follows him like a shadow. Every documentary, every anniversary, every new theory brings it all back. Patsy Ramsey died in 2006, carrying questions and accusations to her grave. Her last years were spent fighting two battles, one against cancer, the other against a public that had already convicted her in their minds. The Boulder Police Department still maintains an active investigation. They still accept tips. They still review evidence. But with each passing year, the likelihood of a resolution grows dimmer. Witnesses age. Memories fade. Evidence degrades. And whoever was responsible that night has had nearly 3 decades to disappear into obscurity, to build a new life, to bury their secrets so deep it may never surface. Here's something most people don't consider. If the perpetrator is still alive, they've lived with this knowledge every single day for 28 years. They've watched the documentaries, read the articles, seen JonBenét's face on magazine covers and television screens. They've heard the theories, the accusations, the debates, and they've said nothing. That level of silence requires either complete detachment from humanity or a burden so crushing it's hard to imagine carrying it. Unless, of course, they've convinced themselves they were justified, or that too much time has passed, or that the secret is safer locked away forever. The case of JonBenét Ramsey has become something bigger than itself. It's a symbol of every unsolved mystery, every family torn apart by tragedy, every question that refuses to be answered. It reminds us that justice isn't guaranteed, that sometimes, despite forensic science, despite thousands of man-hours, despite public pressure and media attention and desperate families pleading for truth, some cases remain frozen in time. But it also reminds us that people don't forget. A new generation discovers this story every few years. They review the evidence with fresh eyes. They ask new questions. They apply modern thinking to old problems. And occasionally that leads somewhere unexpected. Cold cases have been solved after 40, 50, even 60 years. DNA databases grow larger every day. Technology improves. Methods evolve. What seemed impossible in 1996 becomes routine in 2026. So while the case remains unsolved, it's not unsolvable. Somewhere in those crime scene photos, in that bizarre ransom note, in that unknown DNA profile, in the thousands of pages of evidence, the answer exists. It's there, waiting for the right person to see it from the right angle at the right moment with the right resources. JonBenét Ramsey deserves that moment. She deserves to be more than a mystery, more than a tabloid headline, more than a cautionary tale about pageants or parenting or media obsession. She deserves to be remembered as a child who loved performing, who made her family laugh, who had dreams and hopes and a future that was stolen from her. And whoever took that future, whoever entered that house on Christmas night 1996 and committed an act so brutal it still haunts a nation nearly 3 decades later, they deserve to be held accountable. Whether that happens tomorrow or 10 years from now or in some future we can't yet imagine, the pursuit of that accountability continues. If you've been moved by this story, if you believe that unsolved cases like this one matter, share it. Talk about it. Keep JonBenét's name alive not as a mystery, but as a person who deserved better. Subscribe if you want to explore more cases that refuse to fade, more stories that challenge our understanding of justice, more mysteries that remind us how fragile truth can be. Because some crimes don't age, they don't soften with time, they don't release their grip on our collective conscience. They sit there waiting, patient, persistent, and sometimes, after decades of silence, they finally speak. The question is whether anyone will be listening when they do. JonBenét Patricia Ramsey, born August 6, 1990, gone December 26, 1996. 6 years old forever, but not forgotten, never forgotten. And somewhere, buried in the darkness of that Christmas night, the truth remains, waiting to be found.